Yeah, now we are streaming on YouTube. Excellent. Okay, let me just start it. It's my Zoom. Okay, here we go. So, well, hello everybody. Welcome to our monthly edition of UCL AI Insights. I'm your host, Adriano Koshiyama, a research fellow here at the UCL Computer Science Department. With the drive towards automation and digital transformation, now I guess accelerated by COVID-19, research and development and deployment of ML AI systems continue to increase. Aligning with this, there's a significant policy and standards debate. I believe that this decade will be dominated by this, as previous decade was about data. This UCL AI Insights event will explore the evolving and critical field of AI governance. And to talk about this topic, the speakers composing our panel we have, just a moment, sorry, Elizabeth Lomas. She is a senior lecturer in information governance at UCL, where she teaches on the archives and record management, library and information studies program. Her research interests include information governance, information rights law, archives and heritage management, and research methods in information science. Welcome, Elizabeth. My other guest is Pete Ray. Pete Ray is principal engineer in Cisco's Chief Technology and Architecture Office. He works on a variety of innovation projects and has a background in complex and large-scale data management solutions. He is part of the team helping to define Cisco's internal processes around the ethical use of data and AI. Welcome, Pete. So I'm just going to open the floor to Pete for his introductory presentation, and then we start to have a debate afterwards. Thanks for that.
Okay, thank you, Adriano. So I'm just going to do a few slides, not too many, maybe just sort of 10, 15 minutes of a few brief slides, and then we'll have some time for Q&A, hopefully. So let me navigate the sharing problem here. So can we see these slides? I assume we can. Okay, so let me talk about this subject, the rocky road of digital ethics. It is very rocky, for sure. What I'm going to do is I'm going to present, these slides, there's 12 points, but I'm not going to actually dwell on all 12. Some of them I'll just let go by. And so if people want to go back over the recording and read some of, I left them in so that you can see them on the recording. I think they're 12 quite nice points, but given the time, we won't have time to go over all 12. So Cisco, like many other companies, are refreshing our approach to digital ethics because of the new technologies that are emerging and the new challenges that come with those technologies. We're quite advantageous for us not to be essentially a business to consumer company, so we don't have some of the same impacts that some of the consumer-facing companies like Microsoft and Google and others have. But nevertheless, we do have some very significant challenges ahead, and we do a lot of consumer software, including WebEx, which is a huge platform for online collaboration, etc. So I won't dwell on why it's new and what's new. Clearly, different things are changing, and that makes digital ethics a new topic again, as it has been in the past. And we won't dwell on that here because I'm sure you know that. Let me talk a little bit about what success would look like for us. What would be a successful end to this journey on digital ethics? Well, what we would like to see is, as a business, what we would like to see is clear rules and structures which enable the safe and ethical use. A balance between the outcomes for individuals and society. We certainly don't expect both parties will be, there's no ideal solution here. Not everybody can win. There'll always be compromises, so we need a good balance. Good working partnerships between citizens, governments and businesses is certainly what we're aiming for. Cisco is an ethical company. We want to do full regulatory and legal compliance. In fact, that's not something we want to do. That's something we mandate. We don't enter a market unless we can do it in a completely regulated and legal way, and we'd rather walk away from a market than not do that. And the ability to make mistakes and iterate. this is quite important for us because it's a new area, and innovation means the ability to experiment, which means that you will make mistakes. So if mistakes are punished in a draconian way, then it might be better not to start. And we see some of this in some of the things happening where companies are withdrawing from the face recognition market, big companies, for fear of making a mistake and being punished. But then that hampers innovation, which could occur. What would be some bad outcomes? So what are we trying to avoid? Certainly damage to our brand and our reputation, which we take very seriously, and we spent many years trying to establish through lots of ethical processes. But also compromising our values and the values of our employees as well. We don't want to get in a situation where we are doing things which our employees themselves are uncomfortable with and have kind of walkouts and things which we've seen in some of the other tech giants in California. We want to avoid burdensome regulation, which adds cost and stifles innovation. I spoke a little bit about that previously. And there is, significant danger that some of the early regulation might be clumsy and might, stop us from getting on with things. We want to avoid multiple, inconsistent, conflicting, region-specific rules and guidelines. And actually, I would add here sector-specific guidelines rules. Cisco is a global company, and we operate horizontally across lots of countries and lots of technologies and lots of domains. And it would be very difficult for us to set one set of rules in one market and have another set of rules in another market, or to have one set of rules for one sector and another set of rules for another sector. Now, in practice, this already happens. The rules for Europe aren't the same as the rules for the US, aren't the same as the rules for China, and the rules for finance aren't the same as the rules for healthcare. And we kind of do some of that. But what we're trying to find here is we don't want to run a situation where the whole of AI or ML is fractured this way. There's no reason why this one needs to end in such a fractured way. So, and this is the kind of thing that would kill all the productivity that we would have and would make it very difficult for us to enter markets. And finally, forced sharing of intellectual property is something we want to avoid. If we're going to invest in something and we're going to develop it, that's our intellectual property, and we've probably put a lot of money and time and effort behind that. And then what we don't want to do is be forced to share that by clumsy legislation that says you have to put it in the public domain, or you have to expose the nuts and bolts of it to regulatory organizations. I'm not saying we wouldn't do that if we were asked to, but it would certainly create problems, and it might sort of stifle investment for us. What are some of the parameters of the issue? So this is one of the slides I won't dwell on because it doesn't have the magic red star, but you can read this, and I'm sure people will be aware of some of these areas, but where we're putting our focus. So what values do we measure ourselves against? And this is an important point, because if you're talking about sort of ethical use of data, then that does imply the existence of a moral code. So you have to say, well, whose moral code? Is it the companies? Is it a sector one? Is it the employees? Is it the country? And what we want to avoid here is a kind of burden shift from governments to businesses, which has already happened in places like censorship, for instance. Censorship used to be firmly in control by governments, and the executives used to set the rules. The legislatures would cement the rules into law, and the judiciary would police the rules, and everybody knew what censorship meant. But over time now, censorship has drifted away, and now has become the job of commercial companies to make difficult value judgments about what they will and won't allow on their platforms, and this is something that social media platforms are struggling with very much. And there's been this subtle burden shift where governments have kind of said, well, it's really too complicated for us, why don't you guys just kind of self-regulate in the censorship area? And what we want to avoid is that ethics ends the same way, that people are expecting companies, employees to be sitting around dreaming up what a good ethics is. Now, that's not to say we don't do that. We have very, very firm ideas of what are the ethical boundaries of what we would do, okay? And they are actually well ahead of the legal structures. But my point is, it's really the role of governments and regulators to underpin that with ethical decision-making frameworks and for us to fit within them. We can't be the only ones doing that, and governments can't shift the focus onto commercial companies to do that. I won't dwell on what is fairness. This is a very complicated topic. And Adriano and Emery and others will be all over the complexity of this, but this is quite an important definition for us. I would say that we try not to, well, I at least try not to use the term fair anymore. I think it's, I always say fair is the new F word, because it carries with it too much of a colloquial meaning and a religious meaning and a social meaning. So we try to move away from that term if we can. Fairness by design, by assessment. Again, I won't dwell on this, but this is a very interesting topic, which you can come back to on the recording. This is an interesting thing. Can anything be ethical by default? Okay, so in our development process in Cisco, nothing is secure by default. I can't just produce a piece of software and declare it to be secure. Okay, I have to seek a security clearance for my product in order to be able to sell any goods and services based upon it. Okay, and until I seek that clearance, it's not really a product in Cisco land. And clearance means passing a set of very well-defined criteria. Everybody knows what they are. You can enumerate them by project type. There's tooling in web apps to decide whether you've met. There's test cases. There's people who sign them off. Ultimately, somebody at several levels above me in the grading criteria has to sign that the process has been met. And at that point, the tool will be declared to be a secure tool and then can move forward to product. So an open question, and one that we haven't certainly made a decision on, is can we say that nothing is ethical by default? What would an ethical clearance model look like? If I produce a piece of software and in order to sell it, I need to have some kind of ethical clearance tooling and methodologies, what would they look like? And how would that work in practice? Could we objectify the process so that it's easy for people to measure and test, or is it too complicated? Is it too human and not enough of an objective assessment? So this is quite a difficult thing. I mean, we certainly haven't taken the decision to say that nothing is ethical by default, but it's a very attractive and challenging question because it kind of places ethics in the same place as our security, which is a place that we're very good at and very solid at. Perhaps the most difficult question is, are our teams themselves representative? Like, if we come up with a definition of fairness for a piece of software in terms of, you know, the biases and ironing out the biases it may exhibit, is that reflected well within the development team itself? Is that even a valid question? Does that question even matter? You know, we have inherent gender and ethnicity imbalances in our industry. Okay, Cisco does very well at these, but we still suffer from the industry-wide imbalances, especially gender imbalances, which are a huge issue, almost so big that people have forgotten them. And so does that mean that some of this is compromised from the start? You know, if we arrive at models which are only produced by one group, only produced by men, or only produced by Europeans, does that compromise the model by definition, even if they do it with an eye to bias mitigation? Do we need to create interdisciplinary teams? Do we need to hire social scientists to be embedded inside teams of data scientists and technologists? And if that's the case, are we approaching a skills cliff? Like, where do we find these people? Are they around? Are they even around to hire? Again, these aren't anything that we've taken a decision on, but these are kinds of difficult questions that we have to pose ourselves as we move into this area. And, you know, are the rules of how we worked in the past going to be valid going forward? Considering reasonable worst outcomes, again, this is a slide I won't dwell on. It's a very good technique. We do it all the time in our security procedures. It's called threat modeling. And, you know, the question is, do we do the same thing in ethics modeling, ethics bias modeling, for instance? Engineering-led or legal-led approaches. Again, this is a slide I won't dwell on, but you can read it. And it's an open debate as to whether these ethical processes are better grown out of engineering practice or legal practice. Most of our GDPR stuff is grown out of the legal practices, whereas most of our security clearance is born out of engineering practice. So where does the ethics processes live best? We can't control what other people are doing. Another slide I won't dwell on. Cisco has a huge partner network. We have a huge number of resellers. We have people integrating our technology into their technology. So how does that work? If we produce a piece of technology and then someone integrates it into their technology and then does something unethical overall, are we playing a part in that or not? And do our legal structures already cover us for those acceptable content or acceptable usage policies? And this is the last point I'll raise today, towards auditable ethics. I think this is a route that we would very much like to see emerging. I think it's still very nascent and still very new, but it's very helpful. We want to innovate, but we want to innovate on the right thing. We don't want to innovate necessarily on our ethical approaches. That's not the place. We want to innovate on the actual functionality we're doing. And the ethical process, we'd rather, was the same that everybody else was using. The law is the floor. So the law sets the absolute bottom line of what you must do, and absolutely we will adhere to that. But actually we want to do something quite north of that. We want an ethical approach to be way above what the law says you can't do. And we want to be open and honest about what we're doing. And it would be great if we could move to a body where we could call in a third party to audit what we're doing and to give us some kind of clearance mechanism. Sometimes just to give ourselves, a confidence that we're doing the right thing, but also to give our customers and our partners and consumers confidence that we're doing the right thing and to help us know where we need to change. And, we do this with our finances. Obviously, we're required to do this with our finances. We have lots of internal, very ethical process about how we do our finances. I've just been through the Code of Business Conduct training, which is mandatory every year in Cisco for that. We do way more than the law suggests, but then we also invite in third parties to check that we've done all that and sign those accounts off and say, yes, you follow the rules. And is that something that we could do on an ethical basis? Could we move towards auditable processes? So that we can move ethics sort of off the table. We can say, look, we know we're doing it right. We know we're doing it better than most, or we know we're doing it best of breed, and we can get on with producing really great functionality for people. So that's a kind of overview of some of the issues we've got. I put 12 there on the slide. I sort of spoke to 6 in detail. 6 I went through a little bit faster, but you're happy to take questions on any of those. And the 12, by the way, isn't even all of them. There's a lot of challenges. There's just 12 of the bigger ones that affect us as a business that I've picked. We're still on this journey. We are we take it very seriously. We have quite a lot of people around the company working on working groups split into different areas to look at what we need to do and how we need to change. Some of those changes are starting to happen already. Many of those changes are still being discussed. But I think other companies are doing other things, and really what we want to do as much as possible is have dialogues with people, because I said we don't want to innovate in this area. We just want to be open and honest, and we have a dialogue with people. Say, well, what are you doing? This is what we're doing. Does this work for you? And come to some kind of industry consensus. And I think the industry consensus will have to come before the regulators in this particular instance. I think it's likely the regulators will bake in to law what consensus generally emerges in the ethical parts of the business anyway. Obviously, there's always startups or other areas of the world where perhaps people are playing more fast and loose. That's it for my slides. Let me stop sharing, coming back into Vision.
Yes, excellent.
Okay, so that's my slide. So I don't know if anybody has any questions from that. Or
Excellent, Pete. Thanks for that. I guess I would maybe open the floor for the questions. And I guess if Elizabeth wants to make an intervention, please also feel free for that. I'm just going to start with a question from the audience. There's a question on Cisco is an international company, Pete. How do you see negotiating the different jurisdictions? Are you seeing any consensus in industry standards? If you compare particularly the US and I guess European, which we see, of course, a big, I'm not going to say a massive different approach for sure, but clearly there are differences.
This is a very big issue, and it's a very difficult issue. And generally, in a regulation sense, the world, there's kind of 4 global approaches, I would say. There's a European approach, which is very much leads on citizen rights and citizen consent, and this is the broad European approach. There's an East Coast US approach, which is very focused on business and making money and growing businesses very quickly and making regulation very light. There's a West Coast US approach, which is very much about a kind of a free love. The internet is free. Let's all, let's not impinge on each other's ability to do whatever we want, and maybe the money will flow, and maybe it won't. And then there's the Chinese approach, which is obviously much more authoritarian and control-based. And as an international company, we have to play fairly in each of these areas, and it's very difficult. It adds a huge burden and cost. And the problem is really not, it's a problem for Cisco, but it's not really the Cisco, the software's problem, because we're big enough to be able to buy legal talent in every single one of those areas. Okay, we're big enough to buy people who will read the 200-page submission from the EU and comment on every page if we want to. But it is a problem for smaller companies and startups. These are the ones that suffer most from this kind of fragmentation of approach. What we'll probably do is what we did with GDPR, is we'll probably track to the European one as much as possible. Because what happens is with GDPR, everybody tracks GDPR, and it's kind of become a global de facto. Like, you might as well adopt GDPR globally. So I think we actually attend all the meetings and read all the outputs of all the bodies. I spend quite a bit of time reading those PDFs. But the EU one is the one that I think we track closest to in terms of what they're doing, the one we try and influence and check it's going in the right direction.
Yeah. There's a question here from Jess Benjamin. I think the second one that he puts forward, which is the point that you're making about auditable ethics. It seems he thinks this is a great step forward. And the question is, how would you balance this with issues of explainability/interpretability so as to ensure that non-technical stakeholders can be adequately involved in the discussion?
Again, a very good question. And I personally think that areas like fairness, I said I didn't use that word, but at least bias mitigation, as I like to call it, areas like bias mitigation and robustness of algorithms now seem to be increasingly quite well covered by approaches that we can reach for, technical approaches that we can reach for. Explainability, not so much, I have to say. If you're looking for some good solid research that you can do, explainability is a very difficult one, because explainability implies human readable explanations for end consumers, and slightly different from what we would do for an auditor here. In my mind, I see these as two different things. An auditor might come in, might do some automated static analysis over some of our training material, might statistically verify a percentage of the results and things like that. Explainability is about saying for every decision, we can produce a human description that is at least justifiable to a non-technical person. This is a proper challenge, and I don't think, unless I'm behind the state of the play of the market, I've not seen anything that I thought was a really robust way forward on this. Yeah. But anyway, I don't put explainability in the same camp as the auditability. The auditability is a formal verification process, probably statistical in its nature, whereas explainability is a consumer-facing process.
Yeah. There's a question which I'll try to address from Giselle, but one thing that I'm kind of keen to hear from you, Pete, is, when I say we, I said myself, Emery, Philip, etc., we do a lot of interactions with industry, and Cisco is one of our great partners. We also go and speak with banks and consumer companies. And it's funny because when you talk about auditability, ethics, or whatever we want to be on this space, as I said, each one have a different perspective about it. And I think there's a lot of, it feels like there is this kind of general consensus, and there's like a sector-specific approach. And there are things like a kind of facial recognition and natural language processing that kind of cuts across different realms. If there is an element of to this kind of a puzzle, or even forgot the name they use, a mosaic of elements that is part of this construction of some kind of ethical solution to this problem, what would be the kind of the Cisco contribution to the discussion? I feel that Cisco has a lot of contribution on the security space. But is there anything else that you would like to add to this?
Well, I mean, I think I'm not trying to dodge the question, but Cisco isn't, not being a consumer-facing company. We do spend a lot of our time looking at what some of the other companies are doing, and sometimes looking at the mistakes they've made and trying to learn from those. I don't think we want to put Cisco at the forefront of a lot of these discussions, because our products and tool sets don't necessarily require us to be the first people into a lot of those areas. Okay, but as I said, we do take it very seriously, and we try and share what we're doing. We certainly don't want to be left behind. We certainly want to be one of the leaders in terms of implementing these things. I don't think this is an area we want to innovate in and be the creative people, although we do sponsor other people to do that. As Adriano and the UCL know, we do a lot of sponsorship and give funding for people who are moving forward, so that we can address the issues as well as we can, I think. I think there are areas where Cisco can possibly contribute more in the future. We are a global company. We do have a lot of reach and a lot of power in a lot of areas. And there are other research vehicles happening right now, which perhaps I can't talk about right now, which will come to fruition, which we can share when they're happening. The sector-specific stuff, you're right, is definitely an issue. It's a little bit like, this would be a little bit like going back to the 1960s and trying to regulate relational databases. But someone said, well, hold on, that's a horizontal technology over a lot of different sectors. So what are you trying to do there? And that's not to say that we haven't come to a consensus for how to store data. We have come to a consensus about the right way to store people data and passwords and things like that. So hopefully there's some horizontal approaches across ML and AI which is broadly applicable to all the different sectors, but there'll always be sector-specific issues as well.
Yes. There's a final question to you, Pete, this question is kind of coming from different attendees, which is the element of this kind of going back from the UK picture and going international, and there's all the different scenes in different parts of the world. There's the cultural element, particularly on fairness or bias and discrimination. I know that you have a bunch of points on this space. I think a lot of people are asking, is there some kind of universal approach, or it has to be, let's say, country level or even region level approach?
Well, we certainly do region level approaches, because even in our core businesses, different regions have different approaches and have different concerns, and different governments and frankly different societies have different concerns. And we're big enough to have a team in each region who understands that and is part of that, and often is embedded quite closely with the government affairs groups, etc. But there is a kind of a minimum standard that we apply, and it's broadly a Californian sort of style standard of what we think is acceptable as a company. And there's all sorts of things where we could make a lot of money, but we choose not to do because we have our own standards as a company. We have an ethical process which completely predates anything like this. So you could always send an email to ethics@cisco.com or go to ethics.cisco.com if you're internal to the network. We always had a team of people you could report ethical concerns to. And one of the things we're told repeatedly, and which we train for every year, is there is nobody in the company that can ask me to compromise the company's ethics. Okay? My manager can't ask me to do it. If your manager asks me to do it and I'm not comfortable, I can simply say, no, I'm not doing it. So there is a kind of minimum global standard, and I think I don't need to enumerate that. I think we'd all know what those kind of standards are. But nevertheless, in individual markets, we might need to go beyond that. I'm not suggesting we skirt around those minimum standards, but in some markets we might need to go beyond that, and the government might be sensitive about use of certain technologies, etc. So we do have to be sensitive to that. We have a large number of people who could be aware of that. But to be clear, that eats away at profitability, and what that means is it might be better not to enter that market then if there's too much fragmentation of approach. Because if we produce a piece of functionality and it's only applicable to 60% of the global market, maybe it's better we don't do it. Okay, if it's applicable to 90%, well, maybe we'll do it. So these are difficult case-by-case decisions that need to be made, and traditionally haven't been that tricky, but I think are getting increasingly more tricky as time goes by,
Yes.
and more nuanced and more subtle all the time.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks, Pete. I'll tell the audience that we were going to come back. There's so many questions, and I think Pete can also type some of the answers if you see the questions at the bottom. But we're going to come back to these questions at the end of the presentation. So I'm just going to open the floor now to Elizabeth, so she can make her initial remarks. Thanks, Pete, for that.
So, in fact, a lot of the points that Pete has made, I'm actually probably going to have covered the same ground in my presentation. So I'm not going to disagree, but I've probably got a few additional points that build on that scene really, but I'm not actually disagreeing with the scene that Pete has set. So I think, I'll build on that in my presentation, then that will pick up as well. We can come back to some of those questions which probably are raised by what I'm going to present.
Excellent. Let me just, I made you a host, Elizabeth, so I think we can share the screen as well.
Okay.
So I'm just going to make you a speaker.
Okay. So can you see those?
Yes, everything's fine.
Okay. Okay, so obviously I'm speaking today as an academic. My real background is in data protection and information rights law, and I teach around that in different contexts and looking obviously at the new technologies that are coming on stream. And so I've been working on a particular research project, and I'm going to share some of the thoughts from that today. And that project is on AI governance and building ethical frameworks to balance risk and innovation. So in essence, we're looking at all of these points covered today, which is how do you ensure that AI is neither over-controlled to the detriment of innovation, nor under-controlled to the detriment of society and individuals. And we've been trying to bring together government, industry and academic stakeholders to facilitate interactions. So the work is being done between UCL and the University of Toronto. And we've had additional funding from the Schwartz-Reisman Institute for Technology and a Laidlaw Scholarship Fund. And what that's enabled us to do is to bring together around this kind of central question, lots of small scale individual projects. And we've been working with students who've had stipends to work on some of these projects and develop specific projects. And this is where we're trying at UCL and Toronto to kind of build the idea that students are involved in our research. And we're kind of therefore training these new generation of people that we need. So we had social science students, economic students, and data science students looking at issues, sharing together and building our kind of agenda. And we then had a workshop. I've given our website there, but obviously this is an ongoing work in progress. But the idea is that these students are some of the required future skills base that we're all going to need to deal with what are quite challenging and complex spaces. And the partnering with Toronto is interesting because at the moment the UK is obviously in a kind of EU parameters of law, and the Canadian parameters of law and regulation are not so dissimilar. So in fact, ideas around the EU's privacy by design came out of Canada. And it was Canada that was kind of one step ahead in data protection terms. So that's kind of an interesting space in terms of working with partners that potentially have similar ethical standpoints. But obviously we know internationally that this is a complex space that we're navigating. And we know, and we've built on these ideas that data is the new oil. And I've just put up that kind of IT. It's quite an old graph now, but looking at the GDP of this sector. And I think one thing to not underestimate is that there is a kind of politicized dynamic to some of the decisions that are being made, which are not necessarily politicized by industry, but industry obviously is playing a role in how it kind of debates and navigates for these things. In terms of what's happening. So there are kind of political agendas that are tied to the economics of situations. And in theory, we're trying to kind of predict and determine things on national and international levels as to where regulation sits. There's lots of new challenges coming online. And actually, I would say that we haven't even got to grips with data protection. So we've had data protection laws in a UK context since the 1980s. Then we had the 1998 legislation, which was a significant step forward driven from the EU. The GDPR is kind of disappointing potentially in terms of how it did grapple with things. It really didn't kind of horizon scan, and has created quite a lot of uncertainty in some areas, I would suggest, for things that we already knew were coming down the line, like facial recognition technology. There are whilst it sets these kind of principles, there are potentially some issues around the extent to which you do need to set bars or not, whilst not stifling innovation. So I think it wasn't so ambitious or imaginative, and we can perhaps have that discussion. But we know that these things are coming down the line, like they're here, algorithms and artificial intelligence, but also further down the line are these issues around DNA and biological technology. So huge challenges sitting on the horizon. And around this kind of space, there's become more kind of risk in terms of dealing with bots and cybercrime and warfare, and how we legislate and make decisions. And there's a separate kind of technology area of regulation technology that's kind of emerging. So the kind of challenges I see are not entirely black and white, which is the problem. So it's not necessarily citizen versus economics. So it's around trying to get those things right, and trying to kind of ensure that we have a kind of balance around how we manage these things, that we do kind of set regulation at basic bar levels. So what has happened is that in theory, though, data protection, the EU have set the highest bar, and because of those international players that want to operate easily across national boundaries, they've taken the EU standards as their basic setting in theory. They haven't always in reality, so they've kind of sometimes played games with that. So there's debates as to whether or not our citizens have genuine choices around things like consent that go with that. And I think that's one of the things around, you can set the regulation, the players can tell us that they're complying with the regulation, but are the players complying with the regulation? Is there genuine choice? Is it genuinely being applied in practice? There are obviously innovation issues, and the economics underpin our industry, and we have to therefore get it right in terms of recognising things like IP rights. We also do have to think more about where we audit. So the financial sector, because the finance generally has had, legislation for centuries, which has evolved into our kind of audit systems because there was a need and there was citizen demand, because we had the South Sea bubble scandal of the 18th century. We kind of are now at a position where there's such an impact on citizen lives with this stuff that we really do need to think about audit. So that's kind of one point that I would make that really aligns with what Pete was saying. But I do think we need to do more around that space, and we need to think more about explainable AI. One of the students on the projects did a piece of work about the kind of pipeline innovation. And it's quite clear that actually in those innovation spaces, there are a lack of documentation in certain spaces, a lack of kind of the basic idea of record keeping, which is really kind of ingrained now in the financial world of information. But also there are potentially some issues around our regulators and their accountability. So what tends to happen is they cherry pick high profile cases to really push and punish, rather than necessarily working always for improvement. And sometimes a company will be chosen as the one to make the case example of. One of the kind of problems with that is that we're seeing in certain areas where companies get nervous, like facial recognition technology, some of the better sort of players in terms of reputation see it as too risky and move out of that kind of innovation space, and that's a real danger. So I think we need to have better discussions and better kind of international citizen debates, and our press needs to be more responsible. We do have a problem with our media, but we do have, you know, these issues around this idea about where the algorithms have baked in inequality and that idea about mass destruction. So in the UK, we had a great chance with the Ofqual algorithm to show that actually an algorithm could have helped make decisions around grades, because teachers have bias too, right? So when they were determining the grades, there could have been bias, and we could have had a really good outcome where we were seen to have the right algorithm in place that worked with the teachers. But in fact, what happened was anyone who looked at the data sets, it was just unbelievable. The data, they weren't comparing across proper data sets in a way that, you know, would be accountable. So, you know, it was a complete disaster, and, you know, will impact on citizens' understanding of algorithms to have your citizens marching in the street against an algorithm. So there are kind of a whole citizens debate that needs to be better informed, and we do need to have better education, including education in government, because there's ministers sitting there that aren't properly informed about these sorts of debates. And there's chief execs, not in the tech industry so much, but in the people that are going to be the kind of consumers of the tech, that don't properly understand what the issues are in terms of what they're buying into. So it is a little bit like when the banks did move over to different kind of markets, and the people at the top on the board, you know, when Barings went bankrupt, didn't really understand what was going on. We do need to have people properly informed, because there's some quite basic stuff that people don't understand, as was shown by that Ofqual algorithm, that could go ahead. In the UK, we have got this kind of decision point, and you know, in terms of if we're going with the EU, if we're going to do something different, and that's quite interesting in terms of this space. Is everyone going to operate at the same kind of levels? We know that, for example, China are pushing for different models, and we have got to determine, you know, where we're going to sit in the UK, and there will be consequences for those choices that are made. One of the things is around this kind of idea of documentation, and one of the projects that has come out of this, which Adriano was involved in, but colleagues Denise, Ollie Patel, who's just done a report on the impacts of data inadequacy for the UK, and Constantine and Jungshan, we did look at impact assessments. So there's lots of kind of different frameworks for impact assessment as part of the documentation process. These include things like in Canada, they're at the early stages of developing algorithmic impact assessments. In the EU, we've got like data protection impact assessment requirements, but very little enforcement. And there is the potential to look at these as part of that kind of process of audit and accountability. I won't speak for too long. This was some of our analysis on the work that's happened around different spheres and where impacts assessments have been properly researched. There's very few on looking at AI and impact assessments. So this is why we see this as a possible one, because it's a complex landscape, one fertile area. But you can see in this space here on this diagram that in terms of these ideas around impact assessments, we haven't really kind of got any uniformity in terms of what we're doing, and the legislative landscape is complex. But I'm not going to talk for any longer, I think, because I think I've picked up on some points and got quite a lot of synergy with what Peter's saying. But I think there is a kind of network space, and it's beholden on us to speak up a bit more as researchers about what we see as the pros and cons of what is going on, and for regulators to think about this a bit more and more. So they're tending to lead in producing these kind of standards and ethical codes internally with consultation, but there is a kind of still a lack of international alignment, and we know that there are kind of political agendas for, you know, does the EU keep out US technology and how things are going to happen. So it's a complex landscape, but one that I think that now we're ripe for having discussions about how we do make the tech auditable and explainable. And the challenge of doing fairness explainability is no small challenge, as I'm sure colleagues will note. But I'm going to stop now and come back to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth, for that. Awesome presentation. I'll put forward a few questions, and then we try to have a more broader debate, if that's possible. One of the questions, I think, which kind of goes back to your point about the GDPR, and there is this feeling that something similar will emerge for AI, let's put it this way. Do you think that, you feel that there's two approaches, I suppose? One is let's do something completely new, or let's build on top of GDPR. Which one do you think might be the approach that may end up taking place in your view?
So I think actually, you know, if you're going to have this idea of audit, you're going to some extent need to look at the data and the content with the technology. So I think they're not, in my view, this is why we were looking at those impact assessments. So there's impact assessments for data protection. There are these ideas of impact assessments for algorithms, but surely we need to be looking across the piece. And if you are going to start to have kind of audit, I think you're going to have to audit aspects about the content and how that's content's being used and where it came from, together with what the technology does with it. So I do think that they are linked, in my view. Yeah. But as I've said, the data protection hasn't been as imaginative as it could have been.
True. There's a question about you mentioned about the media's role in driving the debate. And then someone was pointing out, do you worry about some kind of moral panic stifling innovation, or even attempts to be a bit more creative in the solutions?
So I think that there is, and I think the one thing I didn't mention is COVID in this space. So with COVID happening, governments have taken a view, you know, we'll have track and trace. And now there's a view we're going to stop, you know, we're going to stop people being allowed to talk against vaccines. And actually, that then speaks to how they push that into social media. And I do think the content and the technologies, like how the track and trace work, what it does and what it means for people, is complex in terms of how it plays out into physical environments. Things like that Ofqual, where people were marching on the streets against the algorithm.
Yeah.
People put the algorithm in place, and anyone with any knowledge could look at the data sets and see it was flawed. I couldn't understand how it was judged to be successful if instead of getting a B, you got A to C, when we know that changes like life chances for A-level students. So it's individuals that sit under this, obviously, and the individuals at one end have got to be responsible, but so too of the media, to properly inform citizens, rather than what they do is like they hype something up over a couple of days, but it sticks in the citizen's mind. And with COVID, we're going to potentially have kind of a legacy about how well these sort of COVID measures have happened that have sat around things like track and trace applications. So I do sort of worry about the responsible media being heard, because our media kind of works in an entertainment way rather than an educational way.
True. Do you want to add something, Pete, to this?
I mean, I just agree with what Elizabeth has said. I think, you know, this phrase mutant algorithm, we're just going to get bored of that because it's going to keep cropping up all the time. I noticed the planning processes for, you know, new green belt was described as a mutant algorithm, I think, in The Guardian yesterday. And it's kind of a perfect storm happening here, because technology is emerging, challenges emerging at the same time that people are becoming, you know, more mistrustful of traditional sources of information and more mistrustful of their own government and their intentions. And all that is obviously being beautifully fueled by the tinderbox of social media, and attempts to try and control that then often are so clumsy they just end up actually fueling the conspiracy theorists as well. So I don't have any answers. I'm afraid. It's a difficult one. It's a difficult one, but certainly the press or the media generally, need to be more mindful of, the effects of their reporting. But that's not just true of our industry, that's true of many industries, I have to say. And debacles don't help, and Ofqual was a debacle. There's no doubt about it. It's like it was a textbook example of an algorithm doing something that was just blatantly unfair to some individuals and couldn't be justified. And those kinds of things are, making it hard. They're spending the small amount of credit we had very quickly. So we don't have much left, I'm afraid, as an industry.
Yeah. There's a question which I think I'm going to put to you both, and I'm going to combine both, which is the question about, there's also this another panic, I think, is, which who knows, maybe true or not, which is like, there is some countries who are, and I guess blocks of countries who are investing a lot on standards and regulation, etc. And the other countries where this discussion is not happening at all. So there's this kind of feeling that maybe these countries are not debating this or not putting anything in place. They may leapfrog innovation, or maybe by not putting structures in place, they're going to be able to achieve quicker results than the other ones who are putting structures in place. What's the view of you both about this point and the point about innovation being innovation enabling regulation or something like that?
Sure. Well, let me answer that first, and I'll leave some time for Elizabeth. Well, look, different countries have different approaches for sure, and that's actually not just true of what we're seeing here. It's been true of all sorts of things. If you want to handle money in a certain way, you can go to Switzerland, or if you're concerned by certain types of censorship, you can go to Holland, etc. So there's always been countries that handle things in different ways. I think the challenge for global companies is to come to some good consensus over what's broadly acceptable across all of those. But what we mustn't do is to assume that those countries that are playing fast and loose will somehow then use that as an advantage to overtake us. There's no precedent from history where that was the case. In fact, the general lack of structures in countries tends to, in the long run, hamper them and to cause problems for them. Just this week, for instance, we saw legislation in a Chinese court to force companies to stop doing facial recognition of Chinese citizens. So these are cases brought by Chinese citizens against Chinese companies, Chinese courts, and the courts are saying, yes, you must delete all this data because you didn't have consent. And eventually, countries might be different, but there is a kind of a broad agenda of what's acceptable. And I think we just have to put our trust in that. I mean, we certainly don't want to be jealous of those areas where there's no rules. We don't want to judge ourselves by those kinds of practices.
Yeah. Anything you tried, Elizabeth?
I mean, obviously, there are very different concerns in sort of niche parts of how the technologies work with different kind of citizen stakeholders. We do see that in terms of how citizens engage with different technologies and what they're willing to kind of compromise. So there are different national beliefs, and I'm not sure that people aren't putting in place standards in order that they can leapfrog them. I think that there is, people they're on different journeys at the moment, and they will all watch different people's standards. So it's like I say, the EU approach to data protection, in fact, came from the Canadians. And I think, like, I would agree with Pete that, we don't want to be jealous of people without standards. There is like concern that if you get the standards wrong, obviously, then you will kind of stifle the innovation. So that point is an important one for those that do introduce standards.
Yeah.
And but then we still need to be somewhat more imaginative and take firmer lines, I think, in terms of, we can already envisage what quite a lot of the issues are. There are some complexities and some red herrings in the media in terms of that. So like legal personality, there was discussion that computers were going to get rights, and these personality rights, that wasn't really about that. That was just about where's the legal responsibility is going to reside. And so there are these constant red herrings, and we could do better with our regulation, I think, in fact. not sure if I've gone off the point of that question actually, but
I think it was great. I mean, one of the things that I found very interesting from this panel that we have is that, and I think it's something that I have from my interactions with Emery, is that he is a kind of philosopher by training, and I'm a kind of an engineer by training, and we try to collaborate as much as we can. In this panel, you have something a bit similar. We have an engineer with Pete, and we have Elizabeth with this whole legal data background. And I guess one of the things that potentially to talking about standards and regulation, maybe one of the things that is missing is this kind of interdisciplinarity. That's one of those words that people use so often and so little actually happens.
So I think that's where we are trying to bring in teaching that crosses boundaries, and sometimes educational structures don't really support that. So that's a challenge in academic context that we need to get better at, in terms of allowing people to move between different components of a program. And I think there is, new degrees that are speaking to that. And like we're trying to bring our students in from different disciplines to help with the research. So I've just been looking at something with anthropologists that specialise in anthropology and technology that we have at UCL, some colleagues. So I think those discipline boundaries and the kind of inclusivity is a really important one, because the off-qual thing actually, baked in the inequality, which was one of the massive problems with it. So we need to have people from all backgrounds and from kind of with different discipline thinking, knowing that they can move into the kind of different tech spaces where they might need to reside and have jobs.
Yeah, and I'm old enough to remember, when I was at university, the computer science department was the one in the basement that no one ever visited, and people sort of disappeared in there and never came out again. Now, of course, those departments are, that department itself is kind of riding roughshod through every other department. It's like there's nothing that can easily be done now without some axis of data processing or knowledge representation or things like that. And I think it's actually beholden on the computer sciences, the mathematicians, to make their discipline more accessible, and to reach out to these people and to try and make things easier for them. And there's also, as one of the questioners said in the panel, there's also a role for general education in schools. I mean, honestly, I'm not trying to be nasty, but the state of education in this particular area of technology is really quite woeful in GCSE level. At A level, it starts to get a little bit better, I think, and we kind of need to as a society in the UK specifically, get a lot better at making these subjects more accessible, helping people to understand them. And I think that will help to alleviate some of the fears and concerns and conspiracy theories that surround them. And I think the onus is really on us as professionals in these industries and academics in these in these areas to be leading the way with that and to make it easier. And I know that universities like UCL and others actually have got very active outreach departments, areas in these, and Cisco actually spends a lot of time on education as well. But, I'm sure there's more we could do here.
Yeah. Anything you want to add, Elizabeth, about the digital education?
I think one of the stumbling blocks about digital education and educating citizens is sort of sometimes how it's done with maths. And there is sort of it seems to be like a citizen fear of maths, and some computer science people sort of blind people with the stats side of things, which to those who haven't studied them is a bit overwhelming. But there are ways of explaining what's going on that actually don't rely on high level maths understanding. So I think one of the things about when we move people across disciplines, we come up a block with some of our computer science colleagues that say somebody's got to have this level of maths to start with, whereas often we can teach people what they need to know to engage with certain things. So I think
I couldn't agree more.
Of thinking.
Yeah, this is what I meant about making it more attractive. And I think some people, unfortunately, use language, technical language as a bit of a weapon, to protect their domain. It's not useful. It's not helpful, and it needs to stop. And maths, you're right. There's a kind of one-shot learning that happens with maths. People say, "Oh, I found fractions hard when I was 7, so I'm never going to do maths again." And we kind of need to get over that. It's not that hard when you start focus on it. It's just that people have kind of got used to the idea of it's not for them, if you like. And yeah, the whole of most people. If I went to most people and asked them to explain how the car would work, they probably wouldn't know. But I'm sure they'd take a good shot at it, and it'd be broadly correct. If I asked them how their smartphone worked, most people wouldn't even know where to start. And that's a problem. That's a problem for everybody, because then that's the breeding ground for nonsense to emerge, and for people to start spreading rumors and lies and nanobots in viruses and things. This is where this comes from, a lack of understanding, and that's everybody's problem. Yeah.
I think we're kind of running out of time, and I would like to make a final question, if that's possible. It's if there is a single contribution, or maybe not even necessarily a contribution, but something that you want to avoid in this whole AI governance space to emerge, what would be that thing that you'd like to see it materialize, if that's possible?
Okay, so that's a difficult one. It's just difficult to get around to just one. I think. I'd bring it back onto the area of, clumsy regulation is what we don't want to see. If there's one thing we don't want to see, is clumsy regulation. We've seen some very clumsy regulation. For instance, there's many examples actually, but just last year there was an example of clumsy regulation to do with censorship of adult websites, for instance, where, probably with good intentions, ministers put forward proposals which in practice are just not workable. It's just, and then you've got to go through months of heartache before they come to that realization and slowly back out. And in the meantime, time and money will be spent. So what we need is, I would say, digitally aware governments, digitally aware regulators, and a good relationship between them and industry, and a good set of practical regulations emerging, and not sort of some dead hand coming down. Another classic example would be to say, okay, we are banning facial recognition technology in this market or this sector. We've seen a little bit of that happening at European level. This will hurt not just businesses. It'll hurt the region, and it'll stop us being the place where innovation is happening.
So for me, I'd like to see constructive debate across everyone, government, media, citizens, to change the landscape so that we're all properly informed and involved in these kind of evolutions and developments. And some of the debates aren't that difficult, and I just want to see people having them in a manner which is positive to move us forwards and not alarmist.
Yes, and I think the debates sometimes we underestimate it, but it's so important. I mean, to have everyone in the same boat, and when you liaise with people in your company or in your group, you need to keep informing them. I think over information sometimes is a good thing, but it has to be on the right way, I guess. No with alarms. But yeah, I guess on this last note, I would like to thank Elizabeth and Pete for the participation and insights provided. Special thanks for America Zin for coordinating this event. Thanks for the UCL AI Center, Computer Science, Faculty of Engineering, and Innovation Enterprise for sponsoring our activities. Thanks for Pete and for Cisco as well, and Elizabeth for Information Studies too. Please subscribe to the UCL YouTube channel and Twitter page. Follow the UCL Insights LinkedIn page if possible. We have a break of our activities next month, but we will resume back in January, and we will advertise it more details shortly. Goodbye, everyone, and see you all soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.